the food movement, as I know it, pretty much starts in Berkeley and spreads out very slowly, but it starts as a very political movement. And after a while, we all got derailed by the delicious revolution. We got so excited by food and recipes and restaurants, and it all kind of got derailed for a while. And then I just wish that hadn't happened.
Welcome to Salon Talks. I am Mary Elizabeth Williams, and I am sitting next to the GOAT of the food world, Ruth Reichl. She is a 7-time James Beard Award-winning author, including a Lifetime Achievement Award. She's been a former food critic for the LA Times and the New York Times. You got to eat in some pretty good places.
I did indeed.
She was the editor of the late lamented I'm Still Sad About This gourmet magazine. You know her also as a judge on MasterChef, but now she's doing something completely different. Oh, I forgot about your best-selling memoirs and novels like Tender at the Bone, Comfort Me with Apples, Garlic and Sapphires. We could go on and on about that. But right now she is a producer and our guide in this amazing new documentary. It's called Food and Country, and it is directed by Laura Gabbert, and it is amazing. Let's talk about this movie.
I would love to.
Okay. It starts in what you describe in the film as a devastating moment in our history, 2020. Take me to the beginning of this film and the beginning of the origins of this story.
Okay, so my husband and I were in Los Angeles in March of 2020, and it was literally this, we woke up one morning, we looked at each other and said, we better go home, they're gonna close the airports. So on March 12th, we flew home. I mean, that was the point, if you may remember, you couldn't get masks, and we couldn't get alcohol. So we're traveling with like hydrogen peroxide to clean things off. And we get home, and I say to my husband, I'm gonna do one giant shopping. I'm gonna buy everything we need, and then we're gonna go into quarantine. And I go to the store, and for the first time in my entire life, I get to the door and there's a sign on the supermarket door that says, we have no bread, none. And I open the door and the shelves are empty. There is nothing there. I thought I was gonna buy all this food, and you literally just took whatever you could find off the shelves, because there was no chicken, there was certainly no meat of any kind. There was no rice, there were no potatoes, there were no onions. And I came home and said to my husband, I think this may be the moment I've been waiting for my whole life. Americans who have never, ever before, no American has ever gone into a store and seen an empty shelf. It just didn't happen. And we take food for granted. And maybe this is the moment where people wake up and say, oh, maybe it isn't, maybe we aren't always gonna have this abundance. And my husband said, or maybe the other thing will happen. And maybe what will happen is that all the farmers will go out of business, and it will be the triumph of industrial food. And I'm like, but no, people are gonna be cooking. They're gonna be, they're gonna be home with their families. And in that moment, I thought, I don't know what's gonna happen, but I feel like this is a change point, and I would like to have a record. So when whatever happens, we can look back and say, this is how it happened. And so I started calling farmers, fishermen, chefs, food policy people. Before I was done, I called 178 people. At one point, at least 10 people said, you're like my shrink. And it was just that I was like a sympathetic ear as this truly devastating time for food producers. All these people who raise things for restaurants, there's no business anymore. Fishermen were in terrible trouble because Americans mostly eat fish in restaurants, and their business dried up. When we went through all of this enormous footage of, interviews that I had, we could have done a dozen films, but we chose to do two things. One mostly focus on farmers and ranchers and food producers because chefs have a big voice in the world and these people don't. And I was fascinated by the story of these farmers. I mean, what I learned making this, it is so hard to be a farmer in America, and farmers are so resilient.
You know, when you talk about how fragile this food system is, that doesn't happen overnight. As you explain very succinctly in the film, this was almost a century in the making in terms of setting us up to fail the way that we did. Tell us what happened and how our food system became so industrialized.
Well, it's really simple. At the end of World War II, America, the powers that be, the government decided that the best way to fight communism was to have the cheapest, most abundant food in the world. And they set about making that happen. And one of the things they did was turn what had been ammunition factories into fertilizer factories. Fertilizers, suddenly we have what they called the Green Revolution. I mean, fertilizers are making the crops much more abundant. They remove animals from the equation. There's a kind of factorization of the farm. The farms all become factories. And what had been animals are now machines who, you know, and then the farmers all have to go into debt because these machines are very expensive. And you see a real shrink. I mean, going into World War II, 25% of Americans were engaged in farming. By 1961, only 8% were still engaged in farming. I mean, that's a huge change in a very short period of time. And meanwhile, the smaller number of people were producing massively more food. The consequences of this cheap food policy have been enormous. We have destroyed the environment. I mean, you know, everybody knows now that, you know, that the fertilizer runoff, which is, you know, creating dead pools in all the lakes and oceans. We have really addicted an entire population to food that's very bad for them. 6 out of 10 Americans now have a food-related disease, chronic disease. You know, we've created this crisis of obesity and diabetes, and it's all because people used to eat good, healthy food, and now they eat processed foods, which are really increasingly bad for us. And we have addicted a few generations to basically killing themselves with their food. And meanwhile, in the meatpacking industry, we've allowed this incredible concentration. I mean, there are 4 major meat packers who control most of the meat in the United States. And that's a whole other side of it. I mean, that's the whole antitrust monopoly. But basically, our problem is that the government decided that this was going to be the policy, that we were going to have cheap, abundant food. And that has led to this crisis.
And another aspect of it that you touch upon in this film that I think is very important is that this is also about systemic racism. And when you talk about how few farmers there are even fewer farmers in this country now who are Black, and that didn't used to be the case.
No, in 1920, there were more Black farmers than white farmers in America. Now there are a handful.
And this disenfranchisement does not happen by accident. And the other thing that is also does not happen by accident that gets us into a mess is the rise of tipping culture. And you do, even though most of the film focuses on farmers and ranchers and fishermen, you do also focus on the food service industry, and you talk about that. And you talk about how tipping evolved in this country, which is directly racism, it's directly post-Civil War. What do we need to know about this? And is there a way out of this mess in terms of paying our restaurant and service workers fairly?
Well, it all ultimately goes back to the argument that those of us who advocate for good food are constantly fighting against, which is that this is an elitist issue, and that, you know, it's great that you can afford to go to farmers markets, but most people can't, and we like this cheap food. And the answer to that is the government supports the wrong kind of agriculture. And we spend $50 billion a year in farmer subsidies, and they all, you know, I would say probably 99.9 of them go to corporate farmers who are not worried about the environment or our health or any of that. And, you know, the ultimate answer is, yes, you can fix it, but the government is going to have to fix it. And how we're going to fix it, I mean, I used to go out and tell, you know, give these speeches where I said, you know, we vote for our dollars every time you buy good food, you're sending a message. And what I learned making this film is we don't vote with our dollars, we vote with our votes. And, you know, there are a lot of really wonderful things happening. I mean, one is that, as I said, farmers are resilient. They are on their own. And the farmers that we talk about, I mean, Will Harris in Georgia, who is like, you know, preacher of the earth, he has found whole solutions, and he is teaching people how to be regenerative farmers and why it's a good idea. There's an incredible moment in the film. There are a few incredible moments in the film with Will, but, you know, where he is given a lemon and makes lemonade out of it. Ultimately, the real answer is we have to insist that our governments start supporting good food and doing it in many, many ways.
And this is an issue of, when you talk about moments in the film that really grab you, I'll tell you one of the ones that really got me is the moment that one of the farmers says, we have so much food here that is rotting miles away from people who are going hungry. The idea that there isn't enough, and this idea of scarcity in many ways feels like a smokescreen.
Oh, and COVID was proof of that. I mean, you know, we had farmers dumping everything and huge lines at food pantries. We're running out of food. I mean, it's insanity.
And this film very presciently makes this point. We are also depending on undocumented people.
Oh my God. That we have so much footage on that. I mean, we certainly could have done a whole film just on that. But one of my favorite moments in the film is when Bob Jones kneels down in his field in Ohio and says, you know, you have a choice. You can round up all the undocumented workers. You can send them all somewhere else, but Americans won't do this work. And when you do that, it means that we will not be able to compete with the underpaid people who are farming elsewhere. American farms will go out of business. And what you will have is not nutritious food picked by people who are exploited. I'm paraphrasing this, he didn't put it exactly, but picked by people who are exploited, and that's your choice. And you know, for all of the farmers, it's very clear. I mean, they really depend on the guest worker. But I have heartbreaking footage of some, you know, migrant workers, like during COVID. I mean, they were so exploited. I mean, they were living in these cramped little places, but they were considered essential workers. And, you know, really, we did not get into undocumented workers in kitchens, but, you know, I mean, the entire American food system comes crashing down without undocumented workers. I mean, every restaurant, every farm, I mean, they make our lives possible.
Yeah, it's a house of cards. Ruth, this film, it's so interesting. It's hard to believe that this is your first time at bat doing something like this, I have to say, because it's a real departure for you. And there's a moment in the movie where you say, I feel like my whole life has been building up to this. And I feel like a terrible failure. Ruth, oh my God, that moment, what does that mean to you, to say that, to feel that?
I don't think I'm the only one who feels that. I think a lot of us who have been really focused on food for the last 50 years feel a real responsibility and sorrow for the fact that this happened under our noses and we let it happen and we thought we knew what was going on and we willfully closed our eyes to, it was such a shock to learn too late about the fact that we had overfished the oceans and that we had, that fertilizer runoff was creating terrible problems. And, I was a food editor for a lot of this time. I ran a magazine and we thought we were doing a good enough job. We weren't. This happened. I remember one of my favorite pieces we ran in Gourmet magazine was by Robert Sietsema. And his father, it was called My Father the Formulator. And his father was a food scientist who really believed in the 50s that, this was like making life better for people. And it's about, I think he invented Doritos or one of those things, but it's about his father's gradual disillusionment with, he starts out really thinking, this is a 50s American idea, we're going to make life better through science. And then he doesn't like what's happening to the products that he's invented, and as they, get increasingly worse for you. And, I feel like I wish I had been more vigilant. I wish we all had been. I think that, we really, as a nation, depend on a vigilant press. And for too long, the food movement, as I know it, pretty much starts in Berkeley and spreads out very slowly. But it starts as a very political movement. And after a while, we all got derailed by the delicious revolution, where we were suddenly very focused on food, but when it went from, really thinking about the increasing industrialization of American food, and we certainly were thinking about that in Berkeley in the early 70s. But then we got so excited by food and recipes and restaurants and it all kind of got derailed for a while. And then I just wish that hadn't happened.
Ruth, let me ask you one more thing then. It's never too late. You're still a busy woman. You've got another book coming out that you're working on. How has this then changed you? What are you doing now to maybe reset yourself and your relationship with the food industry and your career?
It's a great question.
That's why I saved it for last.
There is a certain feeling when, I've had a long career. I've been writing about food for 55 years. And there's just a time when you think it's your time to pass it on and to be as helpful as you can to the people of the next generation. And, my role at this point is not, this is my activist moment with this film. But I think I really believe in the press. I believe in the power of the press. I think information is the most important thing that we have, and especially in this moment when we're really understanding what misinformation can do. My role at this point is just to try and encourage more people to be involved in this subject, more writers, and to be as available as I can and helpful as I can to the generation of writers who are coming up now. And I must say that this next generation gives me so much hope. I mean, we really have the first generation of Americans who understand that food is much more than something to eat.
Absolutely. It is so much more than something to eat. The film, it's incredible. It's called Food and Country. It is in theaters now, but we can also stream it. Ruth Reichl, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for watching Salon Talks. If you had a good time, why not subscribe right over here so you can get more conversations with your favorite artists, actors, directors, writers, comedians, musicians, politicians, everybody you love, and I love too. And while you're here, why not watch another video right now?